I'm Rob van Duin. I'm head of the Office of Studium Generale. And Studium Generale, as you probably know, organizes lectures and debates at Maastricht University. And also the yearly Schuman lecture. And this is a joint venture of Maastricht, the municipality, and Maastricht University. So I'm very honored, of course, that the mayor is here and our vice president of the university, Nick Bos. But I'm also very honored, of course, that Géraldine Schwarz is here to give this yearly Schuman lecture. And to introduce her, please welcome our mayor, Annemarie Pen-Testrake, who will introduce our speaker tonight and tell you a little bit more about the Schuman lecture. Annemarie.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it was 1950 that European countries were struggling mightily with the consequences of the devastating Second World War. And the wounds were still far from healed. And the reconstruction that has just begun would take many, many years. And the devastation was, after all, colossal. What had also been devastated was the trust between countries and peoples, as well as the belief that peace in Europe would be possible at all. But all at once, there was a glimmer of hope. On the 9th of May, at the Salon de l'Horloge in Paris, Robert Schuman, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, took his place at the microphone. What he went on to say has gone down into history as the Schuman Declaration, or the start of the European integration. Robert Schuman proposed the establishment of the European coal and steel community. And this would prevent the historic rivals, France and Germany, from ever clashing again. That was the plan. If pooling coal and steel production with other countries was successful, it would make war between those two countries not only unthinkable, but also materially impossible. And the hope thus rekindled turned out not to be a vain hope. Robert Schuman's proposal eventually led to today's European Union, with the Treaty of the European Union being concluded in Maastricht on the 7th of February 1992. And the process of unification has contributed significantly to stability in Europe, as it is illustrated by the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to the EU in 2012, as you know probably. According to the Peace Prize jury, the EU has managed to transform Europe from a continent of war into a continent of peace. And we must therefore never forget Robert Schuman's declaration. After all, every journey starts with the first step, and his first step has taken us a long way till those days. To commemorate that historic occasion, Maastricht hosts the Schuman Lecture as on the 9th of May every year, a leading academic event organized by, as already said, the Maastricht University, Studium Generale, and the city of Maastricht. It's a lecture that highlights the significance of the European ideal of unity. And I'd like to welcome you all here today. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of this evening's lecture is not forgetting. To be more specific, it's about not forgetting what happened in the Second World War. How Europe subsequently built a safe house for itself, and above all, what we can learn from that today. And we are therefore proud to have no one less than Géraldine Schwarz as our guest speaker. As an author, journalist, and documentary filmmaker, she has made a worldwide impression with her book Les Amnésiques, in English, Those Who Forget. Her subject this evening, learning to learn from history, is now more relevant than ever. In Europe, we are currently seeing the consequences of rampant populism. Intolerance is growing, facts are being distorted, and historical events are being denied. And what is worse is that in various Western countries, These noises can be heard right up to the level of government or parliament. And let's not forget the media. Just a few weeks ago, one of the world's biggest networks had to spend over $700 million to pay off a deliberate lie that served to undermine democracy. In the Netherlands, a broadcaster's license has even been revoked for the same reason, not far away from today. And Géraldine Schwarz' acclaimed book is therefore a very timely one. In it, she shows us how manipulating memory, falsifying history, inflaming population groups, and inciting hatred add up to an extremely toxic cocktail. A cocktail that 83 years ago set the world on fire. The author will explain all this in person. We are therefore honored that she has agreed to deliver the 2023 Schuman lecture. And I would now like to invite Géraldine to address us here at the stand. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a real honor for me to hold this lecture in commemoration of the visionary Robert Schuman, and especially on this day. Today is Europe's Day. And it's a very special day even for me, maybe because I'm a daughter of a French mother and a German father. I feel like I'm a bit the child of Europe. At least I'm the child of the French-German reconciliation, which made the emergence of a unified Europe possible. And maybe because of that background, I think I've been aware for a long time that the life we're living in, the freedom and the liberties and the peace until recently we are enjoying depends very much on how we are able to remember the past. And just not forgetting is not enough. It is much more about how we forget, how we remember the past in order to learn something from history. And this is the topic of my lecture tonight. Until the Second World War in Europe, remembering the past only served to glorify the nation, to stir up revanchism, and to sanctify heroes. After 1945, the trauma of war, of totalitarianism, of the Holocaust, gave rise to a new ambition in Europe. This ambition was that of learning from history. And Europe made a promise. This promise was never again. But never again what exactly? What exactly can we learn from this past? Let me put it simply. We can learn to know ourselves better, to know what human beings are capable of, for the worse and for the best. Not only acknowledge what happened, but how it was possible, how it happened. To understand which socio-psychological mechanisms could enable individuals and whole societies to become the accomplice of the worse. In our European collective memory of wars and dictatorships, we tend to divide the attitude of society in three categories: the victims, the perpetrators, and the heroes. And in doing so, we forget a very central category, which I call the Mitläufer. You have also a word for that in Dutch, the meeloper. It's those who follow the current. Mitläufer are not directly involved in crimes, but through their indifference, their conformism, their opportunism, sometimes also their blindness, they create the necessary condition for criminal regimes or systems. Is it okay with the microphone, or should I skip it? Yes. The Mitläufer are often forgotten in the collective memory because they have nothing really spectacular to offer. Their character is not clear-cut enough. Their deeds are not juicy enough. Their lives are not dramatic enough to give a good story, what we would call a good story for a best-selling book or a Netflix series. However, in my opinion, this category is essential if we want to learn from history. Because under a criminal regime, most of the population are neither heroes, nor victims, nor perpetrators. They are mitläufers. And this is the attitude that most of us are likely to adopt in the case of a defeat of our liberal democracies. Unless we reflect, before it's too late, about this phenomenon of mitläufertum, the fact of being a mailoper, in a way that sends each of us back to our present-day responsibilities, in a way that helps us become aware of the consequences of our own behavior as a citizen, but also as a consumer on political, socio-economic, or environmental issues. History shows us what atrocities an accumulation of small acts of cowardice, indifference, opportunism can lead. When one after another, people forget the person they used to be and the values they once defended, suddenly a whole society accepts things that it would have found unthinkable before. History doesn't repeat itself, but these socio-psychological mechanisms, similar to the ones that in the 30s pushed the German society toward complicity in crime, are presently at work in many countries, also in Europe. And populist and extremist parties and leaders are very good at exploiting precisely these mechanisms. The means of the populists are from today. They use, for example, social medias, what didn't exist 1 century ago. But their rhetoric, their conception of politics, their manipulation techniques are those of yesterday. Therefore, they should be easy to decipher if we are willing to learn from the past. Like fascists 1 century ago, extremists and populists present themselves as the spokespersons of the victims of a corrupt elite, or of a conspiracy, or of foreigners, or of Jews, or all at once. A manner of speaking that appeals to many people who prefer to see themselves as victims rather than facing their responsibilities. Also, populists and extremists are still predominantly in the minority. They claim to be the sole representatives of the people. Their slogan, "I am the people," has already shown in the past what it implies: to ultimately deprive the people of their power. Nor is there anything new in the way populists flatter their electorate by giving them the feeling that they are something special, just because they are white and born in a Western country. Like the fascists 1 century ago, populists and extremists are also masters of confusion. They blur the line between true and false. They discredit rational arguments and satisfy our tendency to myth with historical revisionism and conspiracy theories. They distort the meaning of words. Hatred becomes freedom of speech. Anti-Semitism becomes freedom of opinion. And authoritarianism becomes illiberal democracy. The purpose of that is to destabilize citizens by undermining their value system and their knowledge. A society that no longer shares common truth and that can no longer distinguish between lies and truth can be manipulated at will, to the point of inverting its value system. Good becomes bad, bad becomes good. Empathy is weakness. That was a saying of the SS. And it is also the saying of many political leaders today. Reaching this point of inverted morality doesn't happen all at once. It happens in steps. Once again, history serves as an instruction manual. The Nazis regularly gauged Germans to see how far they could go in discriminating the Jews, pushing a little further as they went. The Nazis did more than just inundate all levels of society with lies and propaganda. They also devised the perfect way of making people become complicit while keeping their consciences clear. They made crime legal. In line with the Prussian state's tradition, Germans were very attached to obeying orders and laws. By legalizing anti-Semitic and racist discrimination with the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the Nazi regime made it much more acceptable for Germans to persecute Jews. This was made even easier when Germans realized that this harassment presented opportunities for personal gain. The expulsion of Jewish professors, lawyers, scientists, doctors, businessmen meant the removal of competition. Even in educated and academic circles, there were few who would oppose the exclusion of Jewish colleagues when their empty posts became a windfall for those who remained. The opportunities became even clearer in the context of Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned property to non-Jews at radically reduced prices. My German grandfather was one of many who benefited from the Aryanization measures. In 1938, he bought a small oil company to a Jewish family for a very low price. This family had no option than to sell. Though he was a member of the Nazi party, my grandfather was not a convinced Nazi. He was more of a hedonist, a pleasure seeker, who had little interest in these sadomasochistic displays of power in which the Nazis excelled. Nazism demanded a blind discipline that had nothing in common with his independent spirit. My grandfather was a Nazi out of pure opportunism. He was not particularly anti-Semitic either, but the fact that the purchase of the oil company took place within the framework of a legal contract, stamped and signed by the authorities, was enough to erase any scruples he might have had about taking advantage of the Jews' despair. My grandmother, my German grandmother, was also what I would call a Mitläufer. She was not a Mitläufer out of opportunism, more out of conformism. She was not in any Nazi organization, but she loved the Führer and was blinded by him. She got even more fascinated when she had the chance to take a subsidized cruise to Norway, thanks to the Nazi recreational organization Kraft durch Freude, Strength through Joy. This organization offered plenty of subsidized activities and holiday trips to the Germans. It was more or less the socialist dimension of National Socialism. And long after the war, my grandmother still raved about this cruise on board of a brand new ship with luxury cabins and swimming pools and restaurants. It was an incredible luxury at that time, for a woman of her social class. Enough luxury to make my grandmother forget that her own beloved father had been a strong supporter of the German Socialist Party. The Third Reich is a powerful warning of how fast moral norms can collapse. Hitler was driven by the will to destroy the old moral order, aiming to bring about a new order that would be more compatible with his vision of a Europe dominated by the German master race. Destroying the old order meant eradicating the values that had infused Europe for nearly 2,000 years. Christian values. For Adolf Hitler did not only dream of a world without Jews, He fantasized about a world free of Christianity. In his view, Christianity had inoculated European culture with softness and docility. It had cultivated human failure by advocating the protection of the weak instead of letting natural selection of the best do its work. During their 12-year domination, the Nazis indeed succeeded in derailing the moral compass of German society. But they didn't entirely succeed in erasing Christian values, especially compassion for the weak and the reluctance to kill, maybe because these were so deeply anchored. There was a limit of cruelty beyond which the even the German population could not go. So, for example, in 1941, protests by citizens and Catholic and Protestant bishops across Germany succeeded in disrupting the planned extermination of physically and mentally disabled people. Hitler wanted beautiful, healthy, strong Germans. He wanted to purge the Aryan race of life unworthy of life. But in the face of public indignation, he relented and called off his plan before it could be completed. Hitler probably cursed what he called the cancer of compassion that Christianity had infused into German society. He understood the risk he would run if the population perceived him as too overtly cruel. But he had a plan. The Nazis had conceived a program of de-Christianization spread over 50 years, at the end of which Christianity was to be extinguished in Europe. The Third Reich disappeared before it had time to complete his project of erasing the old order. But others took over after the war and have the wind in their sails today. They have political parties, think tanks, magazines, lobbies, medias, and are already in power or very close to it in some European countries. Although diverse in many ways, they can be grouped together under the heading of far right. They proclaim that cultures are not equal, suggesting that some are superior to others, the culture of white people being at the top. This claim implies that human beings do not enjoy the same rights, the same basic rights, and that some dominate others. A vision that can only lead to violence and hatred and is fundamentally irreconcilable with a peaceful coexistence in humanity. But this thesis is very appealing to many who are looking for easy answers to complex problems and are seduced by the privileges they could gain from discrimination against the non-white and non-Christians. Many of these far-right populists claim to defend the Christian tradition, while in reality, they are in frontal opposition with at least one of its fundamental principles, that all men are created in the image of God and are therefore equal, and that compassion is a strength, not a weakness. Nevertheless, until today, the values of equality and solidarity and of protection of the weak remain the moral compass of a majority of Europeans. Two recent crises have put them to the test and shown that we Europeans have indeed learned at least something from history. The first test was the corona pandemic. The solidarity of younger generations against older ones, of healthy people with ill people, and the solidarity between European countries, even at first somewhat hesitant, has shown that in times of crisis, we are capable of letting our actions be governed by humanistic ideals. At a time when people are being reduced to algorithms, to consumers, users, and are thought to be identical, to be interchangeable, the majority of us have affirmed that every person is unique and irreplaceable with a basic right to life. We have clearly rejected the concepts of natural selection, of utilitarianism, which accept that a minority can be sacrificed for the so-called common good. Most of us have agreed that nobody has the right to decide over life and death, or to compare the value of one life with that of another, even if it is marked by age or illness. These reactions have demonstrated that we have at least learned one fundamental lesson from the 20th century, that when man ceases to be human, he destroys himself. That our humanity not only lends meaning to our life, but that it is a prerequisite to our common survival. The other tragedy, which has recently put Europe to the test, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At the beginning of 2022, one morning we woke up to war. It was the return of barbarism to Europe. Russian soldiers parading around on their tanks, spreading terror, raping, torturing, shells pulverizing civilian shelters, killing entire families. Impunity is total. There are no borders, no national sovereignty, no international conventions anymore. Human dignity is nothing more than an old dream crushed by bullets. And why? Partly because of a leader's incapacity to come to terms with the past. Vladimir Putin believes himself to be invested with a sacred mission, that of reviving an idealized Tsarist Russian empire, flawless, more glorious, more powerful than Europe. This past never really existed. So Putin rewrites it, he embellishes it, he removes all the shadows. Any criticism of Russian history is seen as a personal insult to Putin. In Putin's hands, history is not only an instrument for glorifying national identity, it is a weapon of mass destruction. Putin has opened a door that we thought we had closed after the Second World War. But this revival of archaic patterns clashes with the realities of a 21st century Europe. The peoples of Europe, who now know the taste of democracy, of freedom, are resisting. They have learned from the past that no ideology, no nationalism, no imperialism is worth sacrificing peace and freedom, and that no past, no matter how glorious, is worth dying for. So we Europeans have been able to learn something from the past. For how long? How stable is our moral compass? In the last decade, memory has begun to crumble, abandoned by indifferent younger generations and mutilated by falsifiers of history, eager to impose new nationalist narratives based on hatred. Extremists and populists are increasingly successful with their argument that it is time to get rid of the shadows of the past, either by forgetting them or by embellishing them. In Italy and Spain, the glorification of the fascist dictators, Mussolini and Franco, is spreading at an alarming rate. In France, a political party founded by admirers of the Vichy regime, which collaborated with the Third Reich, is at the doors of the power. But how could this happen when the memory of the Second World War and the Holocaust seems to be omnipresent in the media, in the political discourse, in commemorations, and even in fiction? The work of memory was not in vain, but it did not bear the expected fruits. From my point of view, one central reason is that many people were more concerned with reflecting on what happened rather than how it happened. Most of them failed to reflect on the phenomenon I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the Mitläufer, those who followed the current and who created the necessary conditions for crime. Another central reason why the remembrance culture did not bear the expected fruits is that many states in Europe hesitated for a long time, too long time, before acknowledging their own responsibilities in the atrocities of the Second World War, delaying the process of memory work. Let me elaborate on this point. In the decades after the war, in countries occupied by the German Reich, like Belgium, France, or the Netherlands, memory was distorted by two myths. Firstly, that the majority of the people engaged more or less actively in the resistance, and secondly, that the authorities had no choice but to submit to the dictates of the Nazis. It took decades for these myths to collapse. Only in 1995 did France apologize for the active and voluntary collaboration of the French state in the Nazi crimes, whereas the Dutch state waited until January 2020 before apologizing to the Jewish community for its indifference and fateful misjudgments during the war, which led to the deportation of 75% of the Jews from the Netherlands. Even such important allies and accomplices of the Third Reich, like Italy and Austria, have never accepted entirely their heavy co-responsibility, and only very late. In April 1945, the newly created Second Republic of Austria hastily anchored its status as first victim of the German Reich in its founding document. It was only in 1991 that the Austrian state recognized its shared responsibility. In Italy, the country where fascism was born, the anti-fascist parties that established the Republic in 1946 portrayed the Italian resistance as greater than it was and minimized the crimes of the fascists. Impunity was total. Virtually, none of the high-ranking fascist leaders and criminals were put on trial. And no one was extradited to another country, even though Italy had committed countless atrocities in the Balkans and Africa. Today in Italy, there are virtually no memorials or museums honoring the victims. And nothing to recall that Italy built hundreds of concentration camps. Eastern Europe is a special case. During the Soviet period, Big Brother Russia forced East European countries to commemorate the heroism of the Red Army, which they actually hated. Many of these countries were actually allied of Nazi Germany: Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and many others, like the Balkan states or Ukraine, had actually hoped for a German victory over Russia. And suddenly these countries were forced to identify with the Soviets. So to take the perspective of the Soviets and to celebrate themselves as victims or even fighters of fascism. And this in total contradiction with the historical truth. Even the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, was struck with schizophrenia. The GDR was founded on the myth that it was the country of Germany's communists who had fought against the Nazis on the side of the Soviet Union. While this may have been true for the leaders, the majority of the people of the newly created GDR had been followers of National Socialism, exactly like the people of the newly created Western Federal Republic of Germany. Decades after the war, whereas West Germany ultimately accepted its historical responsibility, the East Germans persisted in seeing themselves as the communist victims of the Nazis. To sum it up in a slightly provocative way, for decades after the war, European countries, even major allies of the Reich, managed to sweep their collaborations and their crimes under the carpet by hiding them behind the atrocities of the Nazis. Don't get me wrong, Nazi Germany bears the full responsibility, of course, for initiating the Holocaust and the war. But if its enterprise of destruction was so successful, it was because it benefited from the collaboration of many states and the complicity of many people. It was not until the fall of the wall and the access of new archives revealing the countless collaborations from which the Nazis had profited across Europe that the binary notion of victim countries versus perpetrator countries was questioned. One after another, almost all countries in Europe confessed that they were also to blame. And this prepared the way to the idea of a common European memory. A common European memory which would be centered on the Holocaust, a crime committed in all of Europe. This was fundamental for the development of the European Union's canon of values. And it was in this sense that in 2005, the European Union declared January 27, which is the day of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, to be the European Day of Commemoration. In a resolution, the European Parliament urged, I'm quoting, member states to intensify their fight against anti-Semitism and racism so as to raise in young people, especially, an awareness of history and the lessons of the Holocaust. Commitment to this guideline became a condition for entrance in the European Union. And suddenly, in all of Europe, especially in the eastern countries, Holocaust commemorations, memorials, and museums followed. But 18 years later, however, we have to recognize that this requirement has not accomplished what was intended. In a number of countries, a more intense racism and anti-Semitism is raging. In Poland and Hungary, it is already completely unchecked and enjoys virtually institutional status. What lesson can we draw from this attempt by the European Union to impose a unified memory? For one thing, it is obvious that the imposition of a culture of remembrance can be counterproductive, especially in the Eastern European countries, which were already traumatized by Soviet commemoration decrees. Second lesson, a state's admission of historical guilt and the erection of memorials don't automatically result in a recognition on the part of its people of its own historical responsibility. Many have come to feel sympathy for the victims of the Holocaust and may have also loathed for the monsters and high-ranking perpetrators. But they have failed to recognize that such crimes could not have been perpetrated on such a scale without the more or less active complicity of the people. For remembrance work to produce lasting and widespread values, strengthen democracy, and help people resist populism and extremism, it cannot be imposed from above. It has to come from society itself. And the process should make it possible to link the past to the present and question our own present-day responsibilities. Germany's culture of remembrance meets these criteria. Even if facing the past came late and followed decades of scandalous impunity, the process of coming to terms with the past was, in many respects, successful in Germany, precisely because it was not imposed from above, from the state, and also because the focus was placed on the role of the Mitläufer, the Mayloper. That Germany would engage in such a process was not at all obvious after the war. By the end of the 50s, hardly any Nazis were still in prison in Germany. The past seemed forever buried under the prosperity of the economic miracle. The politics of forgetting seemed to have won at the end of the 50s. But this was without counting on the pugnacity of the generation which was born at the end of the war or after the war, and who managed to pull the German society out of amnesia. My father, who was born in 1943, was part of this generation. When he was a teenager, He started to read forbidden books about Nazi crimes. And he confronted his father. What he blamed his father for was not that he had been a Mitläufer, because he too might have had been one, but that after the war, his father still refused to acknowledge his responsibility and the mistakes of a whole people who had cheered a criminal leader. Many of my father's generation in the 60s started to demand that light be shed on the Nazi past. They revolted against the political amnesia and impunity enjoyed by the former Nazis, but also many started to question their parents, to ask them anew, what did you do under the Third Reich? It was probably not easy and very courageous to confront their own parents. I don't know if I would have done it. But this intergenerational breakup was necessary to lay the foundations of a new democratic Germany, clearly rejecting Nazism. So the start of the process of coming to terms with the past in Germany came from part of the society. The second key to the success of memory work in Germany, as I mentioned before, is that the figure of the Mitläufer became central to this task. Instead of blaming a system or a few culprits, an entire society, this took decades, had to question itself. So an entire society had to ask, how can a society become accomplice of crime? And what role does each of its members play in that process? This helped to sharpen the younger citizens' awareness for their own fallibility, to sharpen their discernment in the fare of demagogy, of populism. In other words, it helped to build a strong democracy. So this experience of West Germany could maybe inspire other countries which have trouble understanding that in order to transform the weight of the past into wealth, it must confront history's shadows, not ignore them. But there are at least two limits to the German model. First, it is not totally transposable as such, because for obvious reasons, other societies cannot identify with the offenders as clearly as the Germans did. In a way, the Germans didn't have a choice. Second, because the political evolution of the last 10 years have shown that even Germany is not immune. In 2017, a far-right party, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, entered the German parliament. It was the first time a far-right party entered the German parliament since World War II. It scored and still scores best in the regions of the former GDR. Nevertheless, the mobilization of media, politics, justice, civil society to combat this threat to democracy proved to be quite effective so far. The party's score dropped to 10% at the last elections in 2021. It's one of the lowest scores in Europe for the far right. But the threat is far from over, because learning from the past is a process. It's not a given. It's a never-ending task that needs to be continually nourished, continually rethought, like democracy. And today, I think it is indeed time for us Europeans to rethink this process. 3 generations after the end of World War II, now that the last witnesses are dying, and as this past is receding further and further from us, how shall we deal with it? I have some suggestions. Firstly, I think transmitting memory should be done in a more pragmatic way, and not only in a moral way. Using an approach that connects the past with the present. Younger generations should be able to take from the past what they need to shape the present and the future. The past should help them, shouldn't be a burden. It should help them to understand the world instead of suffering it, to avoid dangers, to identify manipulations techniques, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. But young people also need what I would call a positive memory. They need inspiration. They need positive examples from history. And there are plenty of them. We don't need to invent them like Putin does. Secondly, transmitting memory should not be done in a culture of guilt. The culture of guilt was very efficient in Germany for the generation of my father and maybe my generation, but it can now have a counterproductive effect of discouraging younger generations from taking any interest in history. Instead, memory should sharpen both our empathy skills and our sense of responsibility as humans and citizens. In other words, it should make it possible for people to place themselves not only in the position of the victim, but also to put themselves in the place of the perpetrator or the Mitläufer, to become aware of these psychosociological mechanisms that could at least lead us to become accomplices in crime. Thirdly, transmitting memory should be transgenerational, so that citizens can identify with this increasingly distant heritage in future. An emotional tie is necessary. The connection between us or between the young generation and this past can be established through family memory. An anonymous and generalized history becomes something special and private. It becomes part of the family. Perhaps many will then ask, what does it mean that my grandfather, my grandparents made mistakes, were Mitläufer, or if they suffered, made sacrifices, if I don't learn anything from it? Fourthly, learning from the past requires basic historical knowledge. Learning history at school is absolutely necessary and should not be an option. For the collective memory functions only if we all have a common historical background, one that makes it possible for us to understand symbols and references. Otherwise, the monuments, memorials, commemorations, and speeches remain only empty shells. Without learning what binds us together, there can be no collective memory, no collective identity. A common past and the knowledge of a common past provides us with the feeling of being part of a whole, of belonging to a community of values. And this allows me to open up to the fifth and the last point. Last but not least, this process of transmitting memory should not be confined in a national framework. It should be transnational. It should make it possible for people from different countries to engage in a dialogue, to take perspectives of other people or countries, to accept, and this is difficult, other countries' views on your own history. And this requires, of course, a great deal of open-mindedness. But this is the condition for the construction of a European memory, which is still lacking today. I would like to end my lecture by opening with this idea of a European memory. Without a common European memory, it will be difficult to shape a common European identity. But it is a delicate task. In my view, the construction of a European memory must avoid two main flaws. First, as mentioned before, it should not lead to an enforced commemoration, as it did in the past, but rather make it possible for different people to exchange on an international and intercultural level. Second, a European memory should also make room for other memories in addition to the memory of the two world wars and the Holocaust. For example, the memory of the communist past. A lack of interest in Western Europe for the communist experience of Eastern Europeans is a major obstacle to a better East-West understanding. In addition to the memory of communism, another past needs more space. And it's been taking more space recently: colonial history. Colonial history is the main link between native Europeans and population groups with a background of migration. If European identity is mainly built on the memory of the world wars, of fascism and of the Holocaust, how can those who don't share this European history and the norms it shaped feel included? If we want to live together in solidarity and mutual understanding with the non-native Europeans and their descendants, the colonial past needs to be part of the European narrative. However, this process should not be instrumentalized to stir up hatred or victim competition, nor should it nourish an oversimplistic view of the past or threaten the freedom of speech and the artistic freedom. On the other hand, former colonial countries should not hesitate to apologize. Yet how many are still stuck in denial under the pretext that they refuse to judge the imperial past by today's standards? The acknowledgement of the suffering of the victims of colonialism and slavery is an indispensable first step to engage any dialogue. In conclusion, we can say that today, too many countries in Europe still shy away from coming to terms with their past, their colonial, their fascist, and their communist past. It reveals a profound misunderstanding of how important this process is for the democratic maturation of a country and the preservation of peace. It reveals a profound misunderstanding of how important this process is to learn from the experience of the past to make us wiser. However, at a time where our democracies are under threat, we urgently need the people of Europe to be wiser. With their votes and their civic engagement, the people of Europe have a major influence on the stability of our democracies. It would be fatal to overestimate the resilience of our institutions and of our laws. For the survival of a democracy depends very much on unwritten rules. It depends very much on our capacity to stick to our moral compass that tells us when a limit is reached, beyond which we have no right to participate, beyond which we have the duty to say no. I would like to end with a quote from Fritz Bauer. He was a German Jewish prosecutor who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s. And after the war, he came back to Germany. He was one of the few Jews who came back to Germany with the firm intention to help build a new democratic country. And he was one of the few who understood that the young German Republic had to eradicate the roots of National Socialism in order to start on a sound footing, and that this could only be done by an honest confrontation with the Nazi crimes. As a public prosecutor, Bauer worked relentlessly against all odds to shed light on Nazi crimes. He was totally isolated. He was alone in a judicial system which in the 50s, but even the 60s in Germany, was for two-thirds of the officials of the judicial system in Germany were former members of the Nazi Party. So he resisted pressure, sabotage, and other obstacles. And he actually is the one with the young generation my father was part of, who managed to pull the German society out of amnesia. And in an interview given to Young German in the 60s, he said that sentence: "We, the Federal Republic of Germany have done many things. A democracy, the division of powers. But you can write the best paragraphs, draft articles, imagine the best fundamental laws and constitutions. What matters most is to have the right people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Géraldine and Schwarz, for this important and very interesting lecture. I will moderate the questions, and we have half an hour for the Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will become running to you. I see a hand over there.
Okay, hi. Of course, thank you for the lecture. It was super interesting. I have one question about the points or suggestions you brought towards the end. So your point about education and schools, of course, I think is very clear and very workable. But for the other ones, I was wondering if you have any ways or ideas to approach them practically, because a lot of them I think are very broad concepts and quite broad ideas that a lot of people I think wouldn't know what that means. What do we have to do? What do we specifically have to implement to get there? Also when you mention concepts, for example, there needs to be more openness in the people. How can we do that? Because people are not just gonna hear that and be like, sure. So yeah, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert in pedagogy, so I issue concepts and ideas, but I could imagine that something like a European school book, history school book or something like that maybe is feasible. I know that France and Germany made this attempt 10 years ago, and it was only partly a success. It is, of course, very difficult to write a historical book where all countries of Europe feel satisfied, But I think this is a challenge, a very concrete challenge, which we could try to address, to have a kind of historical school book, for all the students or the children of Europe. And now maybe the European Union, I was mentioning this commemoration day, the 20 January 27, which is actually the only common day of memory for Europe. And I think maybe the European Union should think of another day, or maybe just another way of having a commemoration which includes everybody, which includes those, as I mentioned before, who are descendants of non-native Europeans and who have don't identify with this past. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Netherlands have, for their commemoration day on the 4th, 5th of May is called Day of Freedom. Yes. It's called like that, no? It's Freedom Day.
The 4th of May is Dodenherdenking, so remembrance of those who died, and the 5th of May is Freedom Day.
Yes,
Day.
But it is interesting because this idea of freedom, I think back then when I wrote my book, somebody told me that the idea is to include those who don't connect freedom with the end of World War II, but with something else, in their own country. To find ways to link our past with the past of others. We have a common history of violence, so it is absolutely possible to learn the same lessons from our history. Even if this history is not common, we can learn common values out of this history.
But there are great differences between how, for example, France, you have German and French parents, how France deals and copes with the heritage of the war and how German does and other countries. Maybe you can tell something about it.
Oh, it's a question. Well, this is, you have to invite me again so I can.
What?
It's a lecture. Yes, I didn't mention France because it's a topic of itself. But I think in France, the First World War is more important than the Second World War. I mean, the commemoration of the First World War is very central in the collective memory in France. So this is one difference. The other difference, of course, is that France. It took a long time for France to acknowledge its co-responsibility in the crimes committed on its territory, and still until today there is no collective reflection about the attitude of the population. So there is a tendency, like in many countries, to automatically see the people as victims. I don't want to blame people. I just think this is not a way to build a strong democracy, because if you always present people as victims in history, they don't feel empowered to do something. While if you give people their role, they play their role back in history, then it shows that actually we can do something, we can change something, of course for the worse, but also for the best.
Let me go to the next question over there. Can you pass on the microphone?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your lecture, and in particular thank you for your excellent book, which is translated in Dutch by the geheugenlozen, those without any memory. And I liked your book, your excellent book, very much, and I can recommend it to everyone here. Starting with your grandfather in Mannheim, and looking how, and you then started with the concept of meetlaufer, meelopers. Later on in your speech, also today, you went on to collaboration. And when you talked about the individual, you started with meetlaufer. Later on, when you talked about regimes, like the Vichy regime or others, you were more with the collaboration. You more or less seen, I think, the word of collaboration more as negative than meetlaufer, although both are bystanders, in my view, in the negative sense, in which they make possible that the atrocities could take place. And that's also your focus, and I agree totally with your focus on those third-party, meetlaufer, bystander, collaborator. Maybe you can explain the difference, why you use the word meetlaufer in particular, and not collaboration. Maybe you found it too strong for your own family or others. I totally agree with you. Also in your book, you were very critical about the situation in France, and also looking back in France and also to the Netherlands. And still, when you are saying coming to terms to past, still in the Netherlands it has yet ended. For instance, in the city of Maastricht, we are now here, still a report will be published in some months about the way the community of Maastricht made profit of the elimination and the deportation of the Jews from the city. And that's in any city in the Netherlands. And they are now talking about more or less more than 80 years after the atrocities took place. So coming to the past, learning from the past, making use of it, I totally agree. And then I totally also agree that the focus must be much more not only on the victims, on the heroes of the resistance, or on the soldiers, but on the majority of all those countries who were meetlaufer collaborators and still made profit of the atrocities that took place. And in some way you put that critical note very well, also with regard to the Netherlands in your book. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Okay. My question is in short, how to learn from the history of Ulrike Guiraud. Let me explain. Ulrike Guiraud did the Schuman lecture last year, 2022. After she did this lecture, she take a position in the Ukraine war. She was against this war, and her critic was that in Germany you have a lot of warmongers, but they don't talk about what happened before 24 February 2022. Yes. So they forget about the whole history, what makes that this war came along. So, and my question is, what to learn from the history of Ulrike Guerreau? Is that not a perfect example in how history is forgotten? And by the way, I have to say, she is cancelled from public media in Germany. So I have seen her by Markus Lanz. There were 3 opponents against her, and after that talk, she never is invited anywhere in Germany.
I don't know if you have to talk about Ulrike Guerreau, but...
I'm not sure I understood the question, so I just will answer something. But let me just take your point of freedom of speech. I think this is true that in Germany there is something like in certain ways a limited freedom of speech when it is about the past, when it is about anti-Semitism, when it is about racism. There are many taboos. There are more taboos than in France. I think in France, Ulrike Guerreau would be invited everywhere after what she has said, because it is provocative and because it's good for the audience. But I think this is one maybe of the reason why Germany is still today one of the countries in Europe which resists more or less to extremism and populism. And I think in some ways, sometimes taboos are important. And shame protects us, from the worst. So this is the only answer I can give you to the last point you mentioned. For the rest, I think we don't have time to go into the details about Ulrike Guerreau.
Any other questions? I will first go there and then come to you.
First of all, thank you very much for the words you shared with us, and I think there's plenty of stuff to think about. You mentioned a couple of times European collective memory, I suppose, in regards to the Second World War and stuff before that. And I think, judging by the words you spoke, you think it's very important that day comes where there's a good collective memory of it. You mentioned the 27th of January a couple of times. In that regard, my question is, we live in a lot of different countries in Europe. A lot of different countries had different liberation days have different views on how the Second World War happened in their countries, and perhaps it's sensitive to some people to speak about certain ways on looking at the war, and then specifically, how would you see it happening for a collective memory in the EU? Since you've got different dates and stuff, how can we achieve that collective memory? Also looking at nowadays people wanting to feel stuff personally in their own lives, not just some big concepts, because individualism or something like that.
Of course, it's a hope. Maybe it's a utopia, but you need dreams to advance. But But no, I think it's not that difficult to find what we have in common. Of course, there are many things which we don't share. I mean, it's about what we share, what we share, and what divides us, and that is actually Europe. You know, it's a mix of both. So it's not about denying what divides us. It's very important to acknowledge what divides us in order to understand the other countries better. For example, the way each country deals with its memory. Knowing the neighbor country better is to know the neighboring countries better is not only important to know the past of this country, but it is important to know how this country deals with its past. It says many things about a society. And if we actually open up, I mean, we're talking about the 20th century, but you know, before the 20th century, I mean, Europe was not born yesterday. It was not born a century ago. It's a very old story, and I think what is important is also that we are aware, and that's why history courses are important at school. It's not about only the war and the 20th century. It's about you know, our roots, our common roots. I mean, you know, the countries and the nations are a construct of the 19th century. Before that, it was a big mix, you know, and the frontiers changed all the time, and people migrated from the south to the north and from the north to the south, and so everything is mixed up. And I think it is very important to acknowledge that in order to resist this nationalist narrative, which are actually a construct.
Here is the next question for you.
Thank you for the lecture. I would like to know from you, who do you think are the biggest threat for our democracy? Are these the leaders of the silent majority or the leaders of the struggling minority?
I think there is nothing such biggest threat. I think it's, as the mayor said during the introduction, it's an explosive cocktail, you know. But I think what is important, if I compare the explosive cocktail of the end of the 20s in Germany with today, there is one main difference. And the main difference is that the people at that time were not trained. I mean, my grandparents, there was no precedent. They had no political education. And this is the big difference with today. Today, maybe I will not answer your question directly. I would say the best help against all kinds of threats are the people themselves, because we have the chance to live in societies which are still free, rich, with access to education, to information. So it is all about the people, how they deal with this kind, with information and with education. This was in the 30s, you know. Even if I'm, of course, quite severe with my grandparents as Mitläufer, I have to say that at that time they have a big excuse. They didn't know that they could not learn from history. You know, we don't have the excuse today, which means that, in my point of view, it is possible to, for the people to shape enough discernment to learn to protect themselves against any kind of threats, but not only in respect to populism and extremism, but also in respect to climate change, you know.
Over the past couple of years, rates of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate crimes have been going up all around the world, and in France in particular. What do you think may be the cause of this increase in anti-Semitism and then people acting upon it?
I think we must put it in a much wider context. It is the spread of conspiracy theories in general. You know, when there are no when rationality is discredited, and when scientific truth is discredited, it is the open door to myth and conspiracy theories. And whenever in history there was an open door to myth and conspiracy theories, one of the first victims are always the Jews. Well, it's one of the oldest conspiracy theories in the world. So I would not separate both phenomena. I think it's just part of this wider temptation for irrationality, which is characterizing our societies today, because the world is becoming more and more complex, more and more difficult to understand, and so conspiracy theories give very easy answers, and this is very tempting. And one of these answers is that the Jews are responsible for all the evil in the world.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. I have a question about your job as a journalist. From that perspective, at what point is information neutral, and at what point it begins to become propaganda, in negative or positive form?
I think propaganda is when there is an intention, a very clear intention to falsify information in order to serve an ideology or a political aim. This is what Putin does, is propaganda, because he disinforms with a very clear goal. Of course, I mean, journalists can sometimes not inform properly, but it should not be intentional. That's the big difference, you know. Sometimes it's just because there is a lack of time, lack of sources. We live in a time where, you know, everything is accelerated, so journalists have to be very quick. There is a competition of who is going to be faster than the other. It damages the quality of the work. There is also the tendency to have articles more and more shorter, or TV reports more and more shorter, so that people will take time to read it instead of zapping and going on another channel. These are all very, very difficult conditions to work well as a journalist. But there are still many journalists who do their work with a lot of courage, sometimes not paid very well. This is also another problem. But there is nothing like neutral information. There is just the attempt to present, to deliver neutral information. And this is important, is when you know this newspaper or this TV channel, there is a staff of journalists who are trying to be balanced and neutral.
Yeah, over here is a question.
Thank you for your lecture. I got it. Education for future generations, for instance, in schools is super important, but what about the adult population right now? How do we get those people, including political leaders, who today will deny or downplay the Holocaust or the colonial past? How do we get them to first acknowledge and then second also learn from history?
Well, there again, I can take example from the past when the generation of my father, beginning in the late 50s, and then going on in the 60s, really, you know, pulled the German society out of amnesia. I mean, in the end of the 50s, there were no Nazis in the prisons anymore, and actually there was a kind of a kind of settlement, a kind of everybody was more or less d'accord that the past was over. And it seems like a miracle that actually this young generation really managed to confront their own parents and to make the state change its attitude. So it's all up to you and to younger generations to move things forward. And I think in the last years I wouldn't be as negative. There has been a lot of change, and I think many leaders in Europe are reflecting about the past, especially in the Netherlands, even if very late. But I think it's very much in the public debate right now how the Netherlands are dealing with their colonial past. And another thing is that my grandparents, they never acknowledged their responsibilities, and this work, this remembrance culture in Germany, was not actually aimed at changing this generation. It was really for the young generation, because most of the people of the generation of my grandparents in Germany never acknowledged their responsibility and never really recognized the crimes of the Third Reich. So all this was done for the next generation, the next generation of my father and my generation and the next generations.
I want to close the evening almost. Let's do one other question, and then I will give the microphone to our Vice President, Nick Bos, who will close the evening. Yes.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. You talked about how it is now easier to learn from history because we have precedent. We have the Second World War, and my question relates to modern technology, because I believe that algorithms who make facts and information kind of personalized, that this makes it, in my opinion, way more difficult to have a common sense of what history is. And we see that in America really recently, that they have alternative facts. How is that related?
I think the priority when you learn from history is to really learn that history doesn't repeat itself, but socio-psychological mechanisms repeat themselves. And they are at work in the United States right now, and you can apply these learnings to yourself when you are confronted to alternative facts, because it's exactly the same process. To how do you try to resist, to conformism, to easy answers, to answers who might benefit you, who might flatter you. So it's a way of understanding yourself better, It's almost psychological. And I think you can totally apply it in the context you've just exposed. Don't know if this answers your question, but it's not only about the facts, of history. It's about we react in different contexts, and to know, ourselves, better, and to know how easy it can be to change norms, why you believe something, and to not to trust your instincts, I would say, always to reflect.
Please don't be afraid. I won't give you a summary of this evening. Dear Mayor, dear lecturer, dear audience, dear members of Studium Generale, Thank you very much for your presence and your contribution to a very successful evening. As Maastricht University, we are very grateful to the municipality for the cooperation and the organization of the annual Schuman lecture. And the team of Studie Generale has year after year the task to find an inspiring lecturer with an eye on what's happening in society, and especially what is happening in Europe. And I think that you will agree that also in this year they were able to arrange a very inspiring and excellent speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
On a personal note, it is also for me personally very inspiring, this topic, because once, and it's some decades ago already, I started my career in university as an historian. And of course, somewhere I left the right track, becoming a part of the administration, but nevertheless, history is still part of my passion. Mm-hmm. To close it, of course, this evening would not be a success without your participation in the discussion. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of participation, so thank you very much. And for now, I would like to invite you to the closing drink and conversation in the rafter. Thank you very much.